As I drove along the desolate road on that moonless night, my only company was the dim glow of the car's headlights. I had taken a shortcut to save time, unaware that it would lead me to a place of unimaginable horror. The road grew narrower and winding, surrounded by thick woods that seemed to swallow all light. An eerie sense of foreboding gripped me as I continued down the path, the branches overhead forming a skeletal canopy that blocked out the stars. Suddenly I saw it, a wrought iron gate flanked by crumbling stone pillars, adorned with an ancient rusted sign that read Greenwood Cemetery. Panic welled up inside me as I realized I had taken a wrong turn and was now in the heart of the cemetery. I slammed on the brakes, bringing my car to a screeching halt. The headlights illuminated a surreal scene of graves and tombstones stretching endlessly in all directions. The silence was deafening, broken only by the rustling of leaves in the wind. With trembling hands, I tried to turn the car around, but the engine sputtered and died. I was trapped in this macabre place. I glanced in my rearview mirror, and to my horror, I saw a figure standing just beyond the reach of the headlight. It was a tall, shadowy silhouette, its features obscured by darkness. My heart raced as I fumbled for my phone, desperate to call for help, but there was no signal. The figure remained motionless, its presence an oppressive weight on my chest. I couldn't tear my gaze away. Then, one by one, more figures emerged from the darkness, their pallid faces illuminated by an eerie, unearthly glow. They moved toward my car with slow, deliberate steps, their eyes fixed on me. Terrified and helpless, I watched as they surrounded my car, their cold, lifeless hands pressing against the windows, their eyes filled with a hunger that sent chills down my spine. Panic overtook me, and I began to scream, but the sound was swallowed by the night. In that moment, I knew I was not alone in this graveyard at night. These were not the resting souls of the departed. They were something else, something malevolent and otherworldly. As their icy hands reached for me, I realized that I had unwittingly stumbled into a nightmare from which there was no escape.
I've been the keeper of this cemetery for longer than I care to remember. Over the years, I've seen my fair share of strange and unsettling things. But there's one experience that still sends shivers down my spine every time I think about it. It was a cold, moonless night in the middle of October. The wind whispered through the ancient trees that surrounded the cemetery, creating an eerie symphony of rustling leaves and creaking branches. I was doing my usual rounds, making sure everything was in order, when I heard it, a faint, mournful wail that seemed to come from deep within the cemetery. I froze in my tracks, my heart pounding in my chest. I'd heard stories from the townsfolk about strange sounds and sightings in the cemetery at night, but I had always dismissed them as superstition. But that sound, it was unlike anything I had ever heard before. I cautiously made my way toward the source of the sound, my lantern casting long, flickering shadows on the gravestones. As I walked deeper into the cemetery, the wailing grew louder, more desperate. It was as if someone were in immense pain, crying out for help. I reached a particularly old and weathered tombstone, and the sound seemed to be emanating from beneath it. I knelt down, my hands trembling, and began to dig. The soil was cold and clammy, and my fingers felt like ice as I scooped it away. The wailing continued, growing louder and more frantic with each passing moment. Finally, I uncovered what lay beneath the tombstone, and I gasped in horror. It was a coffin, ancient and decayed, with the lid slightly ajar. The wailing was coming from inside. With trembling hands, I pushed the lid open, and what I saw will haunt me for the rest of my days. Inside the coffin, there was a body. But it was not the body of a long-deceased person. It was a woman, her skin ashen and her eyes wide with terror. She was dressed in tattered rags, and her fingers were bloody from clawing at the coffin lid. I reached out to touch her, to see if she was still alive. But as my fingers brushed against her cold, clammy skin, she let out one final, heart-wrenching wail and went limp. She was dead. I stumbled back in shock, my mind unable to comprehend what I had just witnessed. Who was she? How had she ended up in that coffin? And why had she been buried alive? To this day, I have no answers to those questions. The townsfolk say that the cemetery is cursed, that it's haunted by restless spirits who seek to trap the living in their eternal torment. I can't say for sure if I believe in such things, but one thing is certain. That night, I came face to face with something that was beyond the realm of the living. Something that still haunts my dreams and fills me with a deep and abiding dread.
I had been a vendor near the cemetery for years, selling flowers, candles, and other trinkets to the visitors who came to pay their respects to their departed loved ones. Over time, I had grown accustomed to the somber atmosphere of the place, but there was one experience that I could never forget. It was a chilly evening in late autumn when it happened. The sun had already set, and the cemetery was bathed in the soft, eerie glow of the moon. My cart was parked just outside the wrought iron gates, and I had just finished packing up for the day when I heard it. A faint, distant whisper that sent a shiver down my spine. I strained my ears, trying to make out the words, but they were unintelligible, like a language I had never heard before. I thought it might be some late-night visitors, so I peered into the darkness of the cemetery. There, near an old oak tree, I saw a flickering light. Curiosity got the better of me, and I couldn't resist investigating further. I grabbed my lantern and cautiously made my way toward the source of the whispering in the light. The closer I got, the more the whispers seemed to morph into desperate cries for help, and the light became more sinister, casting eerie, dancing shadows on the tombstones. As I reached the tree, I froze in my tracks. There, amidst the gnarled roots, was a group of figures dressed in tattered 19th century clothing. They were huddled together, their faces twisted in anguish, and their eyes hollow and empty. Flickering light was coming from a cluster of candles they held. I couldn't believe my eyes. It was as if I had stumbled upon a gathering of long-deceased souls, trapped in some torment between this world and the next. They continued to whisper and wail, their voices filled with agony and despair. Terrified, I stumbled backward and dropped my lantern, the glass shattering on impact. The figures turned toward me, their hollow gazes locking onto mine. It felt as though they were accusing me, as though I had disturbed their restless slumber. I fled from the cemetery, my heart pounding, leaving behind my cart and all my wares. I never returned to that spot near the cemetery, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I had stumbled upon something far more sinister and otherworldly than I could ever comprehend. To this day, I avoid the cemetery after dark, and I warn anyone who will listen to stay far away from that place when the moon is high in the sky, for what I witnessed that night near the cemetery gates